waitress noticed what the Hells Angels didn't, and saved the life of the motorcycle club leaders. The diner hummed with the familiar symphony of clinking cutlery, sizzling griddles, and the low murmur of morning conversations. Dawn had barely broken over the sleepy town, painting the sky in hues of soft orange and muted gray, but inside the Rusty Spoon, the day was already in full swing. Sarah, a waitress whose career spanned 2 decades across the same checkered floor, navigated the bustling aisles with the grace of a seasoned performer. Her uniform, crisp and starched, seemed to defy the countless hours she'd spent pouring coffee and balancing trays laden with stacks of pancakes and plates of bacon. Sarah knew this diner like the back of her hand, every crack in the linoleum, every squeaky stool, every regular's order before they even sat down. More importantly, she knew people. Her job wasn't just about serving food, it was about observing, anticipating, and occasionally, reading between the lines of human interaction. On this particular Tuesday, the usual morning crowd was punctuated by a sight that always drew a second glance, a contingent of Hells Angels. Their motorcycles, gleaming chrome beasts, lined the parking lot outside, an imposing metallic guard. Inside, the bikers occupied a large booth in the far corner, their leather vests adorned with the infamous death head patch, an unmistakable declaration of their presence. The air around them seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken authority that made other patrons instinctively lower their voices and avert their gaze. Sarah, however, was unfazed. She'd seen them before, on sporadic visits through town. They were usually boisterous, demanding, but generally well-behaved within the confines of her establishment. Today, though, something felt different. Her attention was drawn to the man at the head of their table, the one everyone knew to be their leader, a formidable figure named Hammer. He was a man whose reputation preceded him, a legend whispered in hushed tones, known for his unyielding will and a gaze that could pierce through steel. But today, his usual commanding presence seemed diminished. His massive frame, typically rigid and imposing, slumped slightly against the booth's red vinyl. His eyes, usually sharp and scanning, were distant, almost unfocused, even when his companions spoke directly to him. A half-eaten plate of scrambled eggs sat before him, untouched since she'd delivered it 15 minutes ago, now congealing into an unappetizing mass. This was uncharacteristic. Hammer was known for his hearty appetite, a man who approached his meals with the same intensity he approached everything else. Sarah approached their table with her coffee pot, her movements practiced and fluid, betraying none of the apprehension she felt churning in her stomach. "More coffee, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. Several of the bikers nodded, extending their mugs. As she refilled them, her gaze lingered on Hammer. His hand, resting on the table, had a faint tremor, almost imperceptible, but Sarah's eyes, trained over years of observing subtle human tells, picked it up. His skin, usually tanned and weathered from countless hours on the road, had an unusual pallor, a grayish cast that seemed to drain the color from his face. His breathing appeared shallow, almost labored, a stark contrast to the deep, resonant breaths she remembered from previous encounters. He seemed to be struggling, but struggling internally, trying to project an image of normalcy that was slowly beginning to crack. The other Hells Angels, engrossed in their conversation about routes and repairs, seemed oblivious. They were used to Hammer's stoic demeanor, perhaps mistaking his quietness for deep thought or simply a bad mood. But Sarah knew better. Her grandmother had suffered a stroke, and the early signs, often dismissed by others, were etched into Sarah's memory. The subtle facial asymmetry, the slight droop at the corner of an eye, the difficulty in forming words, or the unusual lethargy. Hammer wasn't slurring his words, at least not yet, but his silence was unnerving. He wasn't participating, wasn't offering his usual gruff interjections. He was simply there. A powerful machine slowly sputtering. A cold dread began to creep over Sarah. To ignore it would be to betray her own conscience, but to intervene with the leader of the Hells Angels, in front of his entire chapter, was an act that could carry serious repercussions. Her mind raced, weighing the risks. These men commanded respect, and any perceived insult or challenge to their leader's authority could be met with swift and severe displeasure. Yet, the image of her grandmother, helpless and confused, flashed in her mind. This man, for all his fearsome reputation, was showing signs of being in distress, possibly in danger. She couldn't just walk away. She finished pouring the coffee, her hand steady despite her racing pulse. She took a moment, feigning interest in wiping down the sugar caddy, allowing her mind to formulate a plan. A direct approach was out of the question. She couldn't openly question Hammer's health in front of his crew, it would be seen as an affront. She needed subtlety, a way to assess the situation without causing a scene. Her eyes darted around the diner, searching for an ally, an escape route, anything. But it was just her, the bikers, and a few other oblivious patrons. The responsibility rested solely on her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked back to the counter, her mind still churning. She refilled her own coffee pot, her gaze constantly flicking back to Hammer. He still hadn't touched his food, nor had he taken a sip of the fresh coffee she'd poured him. His head was now slightly tilted, his eyes half closed, as if fighting off sleep. But it wasn't sleep. It was something far more insidious. She remembered hearing about a specific type of stroke, one that could mimic fatigue, gradually worsening until it became undeniable. She had to act, and she had to act soon. Her internal debate was fierce. What if she was wrong? What if he was just tired, or hungover, and she ended up embarrassing him, and by extension, herself and the diner? The Hells Angels were not known for their forgiveness. But what if she was right? What if every minute she hesitated meant the difference between life and death, or permanent disability? The weight of that what if pressed down on her, heavier than any tray of food she'd ever carried. She decided to try a more direct but still discreet approach. She waited for a momentary lull in the bikers' conversation, then approached their table again. "Excuse me, Hammer," she began, her voice softer this time, but firm. "Is everything all right with your breakfast? You haven't touched it. Can I get you something else? Perhaps some toast, or a fresh glass of orange juice?" She kept her tone solicitous, professional, making it sound like a routine query about customer satisfaction. This was her opening, her way of engaging him directly, testing his response. Hammer slowly, almost painfully, turned his head towards her. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were clouded, struggling to focus. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a low, guttural sound escaped, a strained whisper that barely registered above the diner's ambient noise. It wasn't slurred, not exactly, but it was profoundly weak, lacking the booming resonance she knew. One of the other bikers, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, looked up, a frown creasing his brow. "He's fine, waitress," he grunted, misinterpreting her concern as an annoyance with the untouched food. "Just thinking." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She saw the effort in Hammer's eyes, the struggle to form a coherent response. She saw the slight, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through his entire body when he tried to move. She also noticed something else, a subtle facial asymmetry that was becoming more pronounced. The left side of his mouth seemed to droop ever so slightly, a telltale sign that sent a jolt of ice through her veins. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a bad mood. This was a medical emergency unfolding right before her eyes, and everyone else was too preoccupied, or too intimidated, to see it. "He doesn't look fine to me," Sarah stated, her voice losing some of its practiced neutrality, a hint of steel entering her tone. She didn't raise her voice, but her words cut through the low hum of the diner, drawing the attention of the other bikers at the table. The burly man with a handlebar mustache, whose patch identified him as Viper, narrowed his eyes, clearly annoyed by her persistence. "Listen, lady, Hammer's tough as nails. He's probably just tired from a long ride." His voice carried an implicit warning, a reminder of who they were and who she was. But Sarah stood her ground. "With all due respect, sir," she said, her gaze now fixed on Viper, "I've been serving people for 20 years. And I know when someone needs help. Hammer is showing signs of distress. He needs medical attention." Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She was pushing the boundaries, venturing into territory that could be dangerous. She could feel the sudden tension around the table, the shift in the biker's demeanor from casual indifference to wary attention. Their eyes, hard and assessing, were now all focused on her. Hammer, meanwhile, seemed to be deteriorating further. His head slumped again, his eyes now closed completely. His breathing became more shallow, a faint wheezing sound barely audible. The subtle droop on his face was now undeniable, a clear sign of neurological impairment. Sarah knew she had to bypass the other bikers and make her plea directly, not for permission, but for cooperation. She looked at Viper, then at the other members of the chapter, her gaze sweeping across their faces, trying to convey the urgency without resorting to panic. "He's having a stroke," she said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the growing silence at the table. The words, once spoken aloud, seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. The casual atmosphere of the diner evaporated, replaced by a sudden, palpable shock. The other bikers, who moments before had been dismissive, now looked at their leader with dawning concern. They saw the droop, the pallor, the labored breathing, signs they had overlooked or rationalized just moments before. The weight of her words, backed by the undeniable visual evidence, had finally broken through their initial resistance. Viper, his face now etched with genuine alarm, leaned closer to Hammer, placing a large hand on his shoulder. "Hammer? You all right, man?" he asked, his voice losing its gruff edge, replaced by a note of genuine concern. But Hammer remained unresponsive. His head lolled to the side, his body limp against the booth's backrest. The situation had escalated rapidly, moving beyond mere observation into an undeniable crisis. Sarah knew she had to guide them, to tell them what to do, before precious minutes slipped away. Every second mattered. "We need to call an ambulance, now," Sarah urged, her voice authoritative, taking charge of the unfolding emergency. "Don't move him too much. Just make sure he's breathing." Her years of experience, her calm demeanor in a crisis, had kicked in. She was no longer just a waitress, she was the only one who had seen the danger, and now she was the one directing the powerful, bewildered Hell's Angels. The other bikers, their faces now a mixture of stunned realization and fear, looked at each other, then back at Sarah, implicitly acknowledging her authority in this terrifying moment. One of them, a younger-looking biker, fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking slightly. The diner, which had been a haven of routine just moments ago, had transformed into a scene of urgent, life-or-death drama. Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The next few minutes would be critical. The urgent plea from the young biker, now on the phone, sliced through the diner's morning din, turning all heads towards the corner booth. The other patrons, who had been trying to pretend not to notice the Hell's Angels, now watched openly, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sarah, however, had no time for peripheral observations. Her focus remained solely on Hammer, whose condition seemed to worsen with each passing second. His breathing was growing shallower, punctuated by faint, rattling sounds that sent a shiver down her spine. The grayish pallor of his face had deepened, giving him an almost spectral appearance. Viper, the burly man with the handlebar mustache, knelt beside Hammer, his usual stern expression replaced by a look of bewildered impotence. He gently patted Hammer's cheek, a gesture that was surprisingly tender for a man of his imposing stature. "Hammer? Can you hear me, brother?" he murmured, his voice uncharacteristically soft, almost pleading. There was no response, only the faint, struggling breaths. The other bikers, now gathered closely around the booth, stood like a protective wall, their eyes darting between their unresponsive leader and Sarah, the unexpected orchestrator of this sudden crisis. They were out of their depth, their usual methods of intimidation and control useless against the invisible enemy that was attacking their leader from within. Sarah moved swiftly to the counter, grabbing a clean dishcloth and a glass of water. She returned to the booth, her presence a calming, if authoritative, force amidst the growing panic. "Don't try to move him," she instructed, her voice steady. "Just clear a path. The ambulance will be here any minute. We need space." She gently dabbed Hammer's forehead with the cool, damp cloth. His skin felt clammy, yet hot to the touch. The contrast was alarming. She remembered the paramedic's instructions from a first aid course she'd taken years ago: keep the patient calm, don't give them anything to eat or drink, keep airways clear. She tried to subtly adjust Hammer's head, ensuring his airway wasn't obstructed, but his large frame made it difficult without moving him too much. The young biker, having finished his call, looked up, his face pale. They're on their way. 5, maybe 10 minutes. The wait felt like an eternity. The hum of the diner had died down almost completely. All conversations had ceased. The only sounds now were the distant wail of a siren, growing steadily louder, and the increasingly ragged breathing of Hammer. The other Hell's Angels, usually so self-assured and formidable, now looked lost, their bravado replaced by a palpable fear for their leader. They shifted uneasily, casting anxious glances at the door, then back at Hammer, as if willing the ambulance to arrive faster. The distant siren became a piercing shriek as the ambulance pulled into the parking lot, its red and blue lights flashing rhythmically, painting the diner's interior with an eerie, pulsing glow. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, entered, pushing a stretcher. Their eyes immediately scanned the scene, taking in the group of leather-clad bikers surrounding the slumped figure in the booth, and Sarah, standing calmly beside them. The air crackled with tension. "We have a stroke victim, male, unresponsive," Sarah announced, stepping forward to meet them, her voice clear and concise, providing the critical information they needed. "He's been showing symptoms for about 20 minutes, facial droop, slurred speech attempts, weakness, and altered consciousness." She pointed to Hammer. "His name is Hammer. He's the leader of this group." The male paramedic, a seasoned veteran with a calm demeanor, nodded, his gaze flicking to the Hell's Angels. "All right, folks, we need to get in here. Give us some room." His voice was firm but not aggressive. Viper and the other bikers, initially hesitant, slowly parted, creating a narrow corridor for the paramedics to approach the booth. Their eyes, however, remained watchful, wary of these uniformed strangers touching their leader. As the paramedics began their assessment, attaching sensors and taking readings, a new conflict arose. The female paramedic, trying to get a clearer view, gently attempted to lift Hammer's head. Viper immediately bristled. "Hey! Take it easy," he growled, his hand instinctively going to his hip, though he quickly retracted it, remembering the situation. "Sir, we need to assess his airway and neurological status," the male paramedic explained, his voice even. "We're trying to help him. We need your cooperation." He gave Viper a steady, unflinching look. Sarah stepped in, placing a reassuring hand on Viper's arm. "They know what they're doing, Viper. They need to check him properly. It's for his own good." Her calm authority seemed to cut through the biker's protective instincts. Viper reluctantly nodded, though his jaw remained clenched. The raw fear for his friend was evident beneath his tough exterior. The paramedics worked quickly, their movements precise and practiced. They confirmed the stroke symptoms, noting the significant facial asymmetry and the lack of response to verbal commands. "We need to get him to the hospital, stat," the male paramedic declared, addressing his partner. "Suspected large vessel occlusion. Time is brain." The challenge now was moving Hammer. His massive frame, limp and unresponsive, made it a difficult task. The booth itself was an obstacle. "We'll need to get him onto the stretcher," the female paramedic stated, looking at the male biker. "We'll need some help to lift him carefully." Viper immediately stepped forward, along with 2 other bikers. "We'll help," he asserted, his voice regaining some of its usual gruffness, but laced with an undeniable urgency. "Just tell us what to do." On the count of 3, the male paramedic instructed, positioning them carefully. 1, 2, 3, lift. With a coordinated effort, the Hell's Angels, guided by the paramedics, carefully maneuvered Hammer out of the booth and onto the waiting stretcher. The process was slow and painstaking, each movement a delicate balance between speed and caution. As they gently laid him down, Hammer let out a soft groan, the first sound he had made since Sarah's intervention, a sound of pain and distress that pierced through the tense silence of the diner. The paramedics quickly secured Hammer to the stretcher, attaching in 4 and continuing to monitor his vitals. "We're taking him to City General," the male paramedic informed the Hell's Angels. "It's the closest stroke center." Viper nodded, his eyes fixed on Hammer. "We're coming with you," he stated, his voice brooking no argument. The other bikers murmured their agreement, their faces grim. There was no question of them leaving their leader. As the paramedics began to wheel the stretcher towards the door, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the crisis was beginning to recede, leaving her feeling physically and emotionally drained. She watched as the powerful Hell's Angels, who had entered her diner as an imposing, self-contained unit, now followed meekly behind the stretcher, their leader vulnerable and dependent. The stark contrast was profound. Viper paused at the door, turning back to Sarah. His hard eyes, usually so intimidating, now held a flicker of something akin to gratitude. "Thank you, Waitress," he said, his voice low but sincere. You saved his life." It was a stark admission, a rare moment of humility from a man who likely never offered such words. Then, he turned and followed his brothers, disappearing into the flashing lights outside. The diner was left in a stunned silence, the only sound the fading wail of the ambulance siren. The other patrons, who had witnessed the entire dramatic episode, slowly began to stir, their conversations resuming in hushed tones, the clinking of cutlery sounding unusually loud in the aftermath. Sarah stood by the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled her coffee pot. The air still felt thick with the residue of fear and urgency. She had done what she had to do, but the outcome remained uncertain. Hammer was on his way to the hospital, but his fate, and the true impact of her intervention, hung precariously in the balance. She knew this was far from over. The diner was left in a stunned silence, the only sound the fading wail of the ambulance siren. The other patrons, who had witnessed the entire dramatic episode, slowly began to stir, their conversations resuming in hushed tones, the clinking of cutlery sounding unusually loud in the aftermath. Sarah stood by the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled her coffee pot. The air still felt thick with the residue of fear and urgency. She had done what she had to do, but the outcome remained uncertain. Hammer was on his way to the hospital, but his fate, and the true impact of her intervention, hung precariously in the balance. She knew this was far from over. The morning continued, but the easy rhythm of the rusty spoon was irrevocably broken. Patrons whispered, casting furtive glances at the now empty booth where Hammer had slumped. Sarah moved through the aisles, refilling coffees and clearing plates, her movements automatic. Inside, a storm of emotions raged, relief that she had acted, gnawing anxiety about Hammer's condition, and a strange, unsettling quiet that had fallen over the diner. By midday, the story had already begun to spread through the sleepy town, embellished with each retelling. Sarah found herself answering questions, recounting the terrifying minutes, her voice growing hoarse. But no one had any news about Hammer. The Hell's Angels had vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving a void of information. The next few days were a blur of nervous anticipation for Sarah. Every time the diner door opened, she half expected to see Viper or one of the other bikers, perhaps with an update, or worse, with retribution if Hammer hadn't made it. But there was nothing. The empty booth remained a constant, silent reminder. The local news ran a small piece about an unnamed individual being airlifted from the town's diner after a suspected stroke, confirming Hammer's critical condition but offering no further details. Sarah wrestled with her conscience. Had she done enough? Was he alive? The uncertainty was a heavy cloak. Then, a week later, as the lunch rush began to thin, the familiar roar of powerful engines rumbled outside the rusty spoon. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She watched through the window as a small group of Hell's Angels dismounted their bikes, their leather vests a stark contrast to the quiet street. Viper was among them, his burly frame still imposing, but his usual swagger seemed muted. As they entered, the diner fell silent once more. Every eye was on them, and on Sarah. Viper walked directly to the counter, his gaze meeting Sarah's. His eyes, usually cold and hard, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, concern, perhaps, or a grudging respect. "Waitress," he rumbled, his voice lower than usual, "Hammer's alive." A wave of profound relief washed over Sarah, making her legs weak. She gripped the edge of the counter. "Thank God," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "How is he?" Viper sighed, running a hand over his handlebar mustache. "It was a bad one. A massive stroke. The doctors at City General said if he'd waited another 10, maybe 15 minutes, he wouldn't have made it. You saved his life, Sarah." The acknowledgement, delivered with such solemnity from a man like Viper, was more impactful than any medal or monetary reward. He's got a long road ahead. Partial paralysis on his left side, speech therapy. But he's fighting. He's Hammer. The other bikers nodded in agreement, their faces grim but resolute. One of them, a younger man with kind eyes, stepped forward and placed a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the counter. "From the chapter," he said. "A symbol of gratitude. For what you did." It was a simple, yet deeply personal gesture, a testament to the profound impact of her actions on their formidable brotherhood. Sarah picked up the bird, its smooth wood warm in her hand. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "I just did what anyone should do." Viper shook his head. "Not everyone. Not for Hammer. We're not an easy bunch to approach, especially when our leader's down. You had guts, Waitress. More than most." He paused, then added, "He wants to see you. When he's strong enough. He remembers." The invitation, from Hammer himself, was a testament to the depth of his understanding and gratitude. It was an unprecedented gesture, an olive branch from a world Sarah never thought she'd touch. Over the next few months, Sarah received sporadic updates through Viper, who occasionally stopped by for coffee, always alone. Hammer was making slow but steady progress. He was learning to walk again, his speech improving, but the stroke had left an undeniable mark. He was no longer the imposing, unyielding force he once was, at least not physically. The experience had humbled him, forcing him to confront his own mortality and dependence. The story of Sarah and Hammer became a local legend. The Rusty Spoon saw a slight increase in business, drawing curious onlookers and patrons who wanted to witness the place where a quiet waitress had stood up to a notorious motorcycle club and saved their leader's life. Sarah, however, remained the same, dedicated, observant, and unfazed by the newfound attention. She continued to serve her regulars, her eyes still scanning, her intuition still sharp. The wooden bird sat on her kitchen counter at home, a daily reminder of the day she had stepped out of her routine and into a moment of profound courage. Almost a year later, on a crisp autumn morning, a familiar rumble echoed outside the Rusty Spoon. Sarah looked up from wiping down the counter. This time, it wasn't a contingent of Hell's Angels. It was a single, gleaming motorcycle, a testament to power and freedom. And dismounting from it, with a noticeable limp but an undeniable air of quiet determination, was Hammer. He was thinner, his face etched with the lines of his ordeal, and his movements were slower, more deliberate. But his eyes, though still carrying the shadow of what he had endured, held a new depth, a softer light. He walked into the diner, not with the booming presence of old, but with a quiet dignity. The few patrons present instinctively lowered their voices, recognizing the legendary figure. Hammer walked straight to Sarah, who stood behind the counter, her heart pounding. He stopped in front of her, his gaze steady. "Sarah," he said, his voice a little rough, but clear. "I came to thank you. Properly." He extended a large, calloused hand, which trembled slightly. Sarah took it, her smaller hand enveloped in his. His grip was firm, a testament to his recovery. "You saved my life," he repeated, the words carrying the weight of his experience. "You saw what my own brothers didn't. What I didn't." He paused, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "You gave me a second chance. And for that, I am forever grateful." Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing not the fearsome leader, but the man who had faced death and returned, changed but alive. "I'm just glad I could help, Hammer," she replied, a genuine smile gracing her lips. "It's what we do here. We look out for each other." Hammer nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He ordered a coffee, black, and a plate of scrambled eggs, just like before. But this time, he ate every bite, slowly, deliberately, savoring each mouthful. He stayed for an hour, conversing quietly with Sarah, sharing snippets of his recovery, the challenges, the surprising moments of reflection. He spoke of the gratitude he felt, not just for his life, but for the chance to see it with new eyes. He even offered a rare, gruff chuckle when Sarah joked about his newfound appreciation for breakfast. When it was time to leave, Hammer stood up, his movements still a little stiff. He turned to Sarah, his eyes conveying a silent promise. "If you ever need anything, Sarah," he said, his voice firm, "anything at all. You just send word. The Hells Angels, we don't forget." With that, he walked out of the Rusty Spoon, his steps slow but resolute, a powerful figure transformed by vulnerability and gratitude. He mounted his motorcycle, the chrome gleaming in the morning sun, and rode off, disappearing down the road. Sarah watched him go, a profound sense of peace settling over her. The diner hummed around her, the familiar symphony of clinking cutlery and murmuring conversations. But for Sarah, nothing was quite the same. She was still a waitress, serving coffee and pancakes, but she carried with her the quiet knowledge that she had looked beyond the surface, seen the unseen, and in doing so, had touched a life in a way few ever could. The wooden bird on her kitchen counter was no longer just a symbol of gratitude, it was a testament to the extraordinary power of ordinary observation, and the unexpected connections forged in the most unlikely of places. The story of the Rusty Spoon and its brave waitress would be told for generations, a reminder that heroism often wears an apron.